In unsolved crime stories, the true horror is not only found in violence itself, but in the silence that follows. When answers never arrive, when responsibility is never assigned, and when a life is reduced to unanswered questions, the past refuses to stay buried. Today on Unsolved Crime, we return to a quiet corner of England in the early 20th century, to a village where routine ruled daily life, where danger was believed to exist somewhere else, and where the disappearance and death of a 10-year-old girl shattered that illusion forever. This is the unsolved case of Amy Margaret Reeves. Amy was born on November 27, 1900, in Surrey, England, and spent her childhood in the small rural settlement of Longcross. The village was modest and tightly knit, made up of cottages, narrow dirt roads, and open common land that had been shared by families for generations. Life in Longcross followed predictable rhythms. People worked, children attended school, and neighbors looked after one another in ways that made the idea of sudden violence seem almost unthinkable. Amy grew up surrounded by siblings in a working-class household where discipline, routine, and responsibility were part of everyday life. Her father, Arthur Reeves, worked as a gardener at the Royal Holloway Sanatorium in Egham, several miles from their home. It was stable employment, but offered little financial comfort. The family lived carefully, managing what they had without excess. Amy's mother, Esther Reeves, was the emotional and organizational center of the household, responsible for caring for the children and maintaining order. That stability vanished shortly before Christmas in 1910, when Esther died. Her death changed the family permanently. The home grew quieter, heavier, marked by absence. Though daily routines continued, they did so out of necessity rather than comfort. Amy was only 10 years old, and while she may not have fully understood the weight of loss, it shaped her world in ways that could not be undone. At the time, Amy attended the local village school, as expected of girls her age in early 20th century England. Education focused on reading, writing, arithmetic, and basic domestic training. She was described as well-behaved, reliable, and reserved. Amy was not known to wander aimlessly or defy expectations. She followed rules, returned home on time, and moved through the world cautiously. This detail would later become central to the mystery, because what happened to her did not align with who she was. Tuesday, July 18, 1911, began like any other summer day. Amy did not attend school in the morning and stayed home to help her older sister, Ethel, with household chores. The work was ordinary and familiar. When it was finished, Amy spent some time playing in the garden near the house, within sight and sound of home. Around midday, she prepared to leave for the afternoon school session. She said goodbye to Ethel and stepped out toward Chobham Common, following a route she had taken countless times before. Ethel later recalled watching her sister walk away, crossing the open land toward the school. Nothing about the moment seemed unusual. There were no arguments, no delays, no signs of distress. School ended at 4 o'clock that afternoon. Children left the building in groups, talking and laughing as they made their way home. One by one, they returned to their houses across the village. Amy never arrived. At first, Ethel assumed her sister had stopped to play somewhere nearby, as children often did during warm summer afternoons. But as time passed and daylight faded, concern grew. When Ethel began asking other children if they had seen Amy, she learned something deeply troubling. Amy had not been at school at all that afternoon. With that realization, worry turned into fear. Amy wasn't late. She was missing. Arthur Reeves returned home around 8 that evening and was immediately told what had happened. For a brief moment, he stood in silence, understanding that something was terribly wrong. Amy was not the kind of child who disappeared without explanation. He quickly began asking neighbors if anyone had seen her. When no one could provide answers, a search was organized. Villagers gathered with lanterns and spread out across paths, hedges, wooded areas, and the open ground of Chobham Common, calling her name into the night. As the search continued, Arthur moved away from the others and walked toward a small pond on the common, roughly 400 yards from the family home. It was a shallow, muddy hollow, known locally as a place where children sometimes paddled. At the edge of the water, Arthur noticed something immediately unsettling. Amy's shoes and stockings were placed neatly on the bank, carefully arranged as if removed with intention. Moments later, he saw her body. Amy lay face down in the shallow water, her head among weeds near the edge. Arthur pulled her from the pond and desperately looked for signs of life, but there were none. Her body was cold. In that moment, the search ended and a nightmare began. Others arrived at the pond, lanterns illuminating the scene. Bruises and wounds were visible on Amy's head. The grass around the water was trampled, disturbed in a way that suggested a struggle. These details made it immediately clear that Amy had not simply fallen into the pond. Something had happened there, something violent. Police were notified, and Amy's body was transported to Chertsey mortuary for a formal examination. Dr. George Hodgson conducted the post-mortem and identified multiple wounds to Amy's head. While none were fatal on their own, they would have been sufficient to stun her. The cause of death was ruled drowning, but Dr. Hodgson stated it was highly unlikely that the injuries resulted from an accidental fall. He believed a blunt object, possibly a stick, had been used. Amy had been alive when she entered the water, but was unable to save herself. The case quickly drew attention beyond Long Cross. Other troubling incidents involving young girls in nearby regions raised fears that Amy's death might not be isolated. The following day, police returned to the pond and continued their investigation. A birch stick was found embedded upright in the mud, with strands of light brown hair caught in its bark. That discovery became one of the most important pieces of physical evidence. Soon after, a local 15-year-old boy, Albert Henry Hampton, was arrested on suspicion of murder. He lived next door to the Reeves family and was known to spend time around their home. Witnesses placed him in the area that day, some recalling that he had been carrying a freshly cut stick. However, inconsistencies emerged almost immediately. Some described the stick as cherrywood, while the one recovered from the pond was birch. There was no clear motive. Albert had been friendly with Amy and her family. No evidence of indecent assault was found. No confession was made. At the inquest, testimony revealed a case built almost entirely on circumstantial evidence. Experts suggested Amy had been struck while standing in the pond, but no one could say with certainty who delivered the blows. After deliberation, the jury returned a verdict that Amy Reeves had been willfully murdered, but there was insufficient evidence to determine who was responsible. Albert Hampton was released. No one else was ever charged. Amy Margaret Reeves was 10 years old when her life ended in a place she knew well, on a day that should have been ordinary. More than a century later, her case remains officially unsolved. The evidence pointed in multiple directions, but never far enough to reach the truth. And so the question remains, unanswered and unsettling. Who killed Amy Reeves? If you want to keep exploring cases where justice was never fully served, subscribe to Unsolved Crime. Because some stories, no matter how much time passes, refuse to stay silent.